7 every day. And according to P. Sainath, who's like a guru to most of us, who follows the farmer suicides, since 2005, it has been 250,000 farmer suicides in India. Now that is continuing. So there is a deep agrarian crisis which can be described as a multiple crisis of falling employment, falling investment in the villages, falling profitability, falling productivity, and so on and so forth. But once again, there also we are following the Western example: more fertilizer, more pesticide, more soil degradation, etc., etc., etc. So now there is a rival model available there of dry land farming, where you use more of the you decentralize procurement. You eat what you procure as government, what is eaten by the people. There are coarse grain, which the new discovery is that those coarse grains which people used to eat, apart from wheat and millets, are actually the more nutritious meals. Now the media, if you see the coverage of these issues, is not the non-news media. If you see all the advertisements which show good life, people eating either bread or rice. They don't, fashionable people don't eat millets. They don't eat legumes. They don't eat, coarse grain. So the nutritious millets are actually out from media. And what you see is actually just the paradigm of basically once again the Western model of more of more of the same thing, where you grow the way the West has grown. You grow more soya bean, make it uniculture, every inch of land will be kind of sown with just one crop. There'll be GM crop coming, and not looking at even the productivity of that GM crop over next 5, 6, 10 years time. From 300 rupees per kg seed, they are buying 3,600 per kg of seed. And this does not get reported. What we get reported is actually the big business that Monsanto and Cargill are going to do in India. Now, we did a research on the top Indian newspapers' coverage of these issues. Now, the top papers they have circulation in around 1 million or 1 million plus. Top 3 English newspapers, top 3 Hindi newspapers, and their total coverage of Indian villages, all rural issues put together, is 2%. Now, 3/4 of India is given 2% of space in the Indian press. Now, in that 2%, you start deconstructing that 2%, and it becomes even more depressing. 36% of this 2% is actually violence, Maoist violence, disasters, domestic violence, legal issues, etc., etc. The second part, 28% of this 2%, is farm business-related issues, issues of procurement, issues of seed business, issues of farming business, how much has been produced, how much has been sown, how much has been sold and bought, and stuff like that. And then the last part of it, which is 15% of the 2%, which comes to roughly about 0.04%, that is devoted to the issues of rural distress in India, which is malnutrition, which is, by the way, 57 million malnourished children in India, which is 1/3 of all the malnourished children anywhere in the world, all over the world, all the countries put together, which means more than Africa. We believe that, maybe we are doing better. So what we see in the media coverage is actually not the real picture there. And another research that we just finished, we are actually still working on it, is looking at 3 frames, which is one is corruption and impropriety stories. They get about 50% of the stories we saw out of these 3 frames. One was corruption, impropriety, the second was inequality, and third was economic growth. So out of these, 55% were given to corruption, which is a good thing. About 40% was given to issues of economic growth in India, Hail India, big numbers, big telecom, big growth, etc., etc. And about 3% was given to inequality. As Herman said in his presentation, that inequalities are like humongous here. I mean, if you see, the inequalities are not only very big in India, but also its media coverage is absolutely minuscule, as if the inequalities don't exist, they are not there. And lastly, I would come to the point of India, the good picture. After all, it is a thriving democracy. After all, there is also pluralism and democratic expansion in India. So we have a new matrix of things coming up by the way of one, decentralization, and by the way of rights-based development approaches. So we have a Right to Information Act passed in India about 7 years back, which means any citizen can ask for information, not just the media, and the government will be obliged to give that information within 30 days. We also have a Right to Education Act now, which is also a couple of years old now, that every child has a right to a school. Government will have to give a school to a child within 3 kilometers of his village. We also have a right to food coming. This is being discussed in the Indian Parliament right now. So right to food, right to education, and we also have a Whistleblower Protection Act being discussed in India. And you guys in Africa would know perhaps that one of the most important things for media to be able to report these issues is to have a strong Whistleblower Protection Act, so that those media persons who are reporting these things, going out of the way, as some of the numbers which were read out by the GFMD person, that how many journalists have been killed, etc. So if there is a strong policy in place of whistleblower protection, then perhaps, although it has not been passed, it is still being discussed in Indian Parliament. So, my grouse here is that we coin terms like policy paralysis and like wasteland, and we attack, the entire English media is consistently attacking subsidies. They are saying that the Indian farm sector is ill because farmer is subsidized. And just to put the numbers in place, per farmer subsidy in India is $66, as against per farmer subsidy in US is $21,000, Japan $26,000, and the OECD countries $11,000. So here are we talking about India and media. We see that there are two things simultaneously going on in India. One is the deepening of democracy through pluralism, through public participation, and through regional media, and through some good media. And the exact opposite of it, which is the shallowing of democracy, and which is the elite capture of democracy, and which is a very selective reporting of these issues. So you take your pick, and wherever we are, whichever media we like, we pick, and we go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Vikpal. And again, you tend to see this in official India policy, a reluctance to lead. So he has really debunked the idea that India is taking a decisive leadership. There is this reluctance because of internal contradictions. Professor Cham has been looking at issues of film and culture and how this inform the narrative of the rise in Africa, as well as the rise of the rest. So we need to just get a few thoughts from him about the perspective at which he's looking at issues of the global changing order, and in particular Africa. Over to you. Another 10 minutes.
Thank you, Depros. Well, my charge is to look at the cultural dimensions of the phenomenon of Africa rising. And since the issue of the current rise of Africa is framed as a question that Professor Wasserman and Mr. Naidu so aptly reminded us, I am assuming that the issue is still open to debate and that it is multidimensional, that what we're dealing with is not just economic and material, but it's also cultural. I want to ground my brief remarks on observations made by a number of scholars and practitioners on the relations between culture and development. That is, the place of culture in discourses and practice of transformation, change, renewal, rebirth, renaissance, etc. And I want to also use the concept and practice of globalization, used very loosely here, to frame my remarks on the ways African creative practitioners of all sorts, particularly filmmakers and writers, engage and navigate the question of renewal in Africa. I want to start by invoking the notion from the Kenyan writer Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who says that development should mean the release of the creative powers of men, women, and children. Along with many other creative practitioners, Ngugi continues to advocate the crucial role of culture in development and change, arguing that development is not exclusively an economic and material phenomenon, but also a cultural phenomenon. Human beings and human creative capacity constitute the primary agency and engine of development. Ngugi and many others who look at culture and development emphasize that although a creative performance or text, be it oral, written, or filmic, does not build a bridge or increase the crop harvest of a farmer in Sashemene, Ethiopia, in any direct fashion, it has the potential to affect the consciousness of workers, farmers, and people in positions of authority who initiate and implement policies and projects designed to improve the material well-being of people. African development and renewal, they argue, must rest securely on African cultural foundations for it to be sustainable and equitable. The questions remain: what kind of African cultures going to form the bedrock of renewal and development in the 21st century? And what kind of African is going to assume leadership of development efforts in the 21st century? Answers to these questions will necessarily address the thorny question of identity and globalization. Postmodernist discourses have enabled us to shift away from approaches that see culture as prior, eternal, stable, and closed, to approaches that privilege notions of production, process, performance, play, invention, and individual human agency. Thus, it is difficult to talk of Africa and African culture and African identities in terms of pure, authentic, unadulterated, and fixed entities. Because of history, Africa and its cultures and peoples have been open to mutual encounters with and influences from outside the world. For the Kenyan scholar also Ali Mazrui, Africa as we know it today is constituted by a triple heritage, he argues: the indigenous African heritage, the Euro-Christian heritage, and the Arab-Islamic heritage. The dynamic interplay, interpenetration, and cross-fertilization through time of these three forces have produced the diverse, dynamic, and constantly changing Africa, the African and African cultures of today, former French President Nicolas Sarkozy notwithstanding. I'm referring here to the infamous and ignorant quote that, or statement that Sarkozy made in 2007, right after being elected President of France, on his first visit to Africa at the Université Cheikh Anta Diop de Dakar, where he said that le problème de l'Africain, c'est qu'il n'a pas suffisamment rentré dans l'histoire. That the problem with the African is that he has not sufficiently entered into history. So we ask, is globalization per se a bad thing? Is it something to be avoided and rejected, especially by people historically brutalized by the prevailing world systems and technologies? Should Africans opt for disengagement and concentrate on forging regional and sub-regional linkages and groupings? Is it possible to disengage from global systems and reject new technologies in this era of global connectivity? Does the use of current technologies imply capitulation to Western global systems and structures? Is the local incompatible with the global? The idea of cross-border cultural connections and exchanges of various forms and scales is something good for humanity, and it is recognized as such by Africans across broad time spans and geographic spaces. African systems of thought enshrine ideas of common, local, regional, and global humanity, and the imperative of connections. We find examples in numerous African sayings, and one was quoted earlier by the acting Vice Chancellor, the concept of Ubuntu. Among the Wolof of Senegambia, where I hail from, we have the saying that Nit Nitai Garabam, that is, the human being is the cure of the human being. Recent formulations such as negritude, the African personality, and African Renaissance also privilege notions of globalization, shaped in part by local, regional, and national African specificities and contributions to global systems. As such, I don't think it is in the best interest of Africans, nor is it in their desire, or is it possible for them to retreat from the world and its technologies. Our contribution to and investment in global humanity is too precious to abandon. Africans are claiming and articulating globalization on their own terms, with all the complexities and potential contradictions involved. Global encounters predicated on exchange and not imposition, democracy and not dictatorship, trade and not export, difference and not homogenization, partnership and not competition in all domains and practices are good. I think this is much more likely to sustain globalization in the long run than the current seemingly triumphant corporate-led economic globalization, whose predatory practices and insatiable appetite for indiscriminate growth in a world of finite resources may not be at all that sustainable. In fact, by many estimates, they may end up depleting resources and destroying environments as well as peoples and cultures. The latter is of particular significance for people who have been historically subjected to and have been struggling against imperial regimes and now have to contend with the leveling force of the technologically super-empowered cultural industries of the sole remaining superpower, the US, as well as the globalizing structures under its control. What becomes of the African difference in such contracts? Parallels in what is called world music may be instructive here. I want to cite Marie Dawn, who is a member of the black female group Zap Mama, who argues that world music is merely a label, a conspiracy to devalue specific African musical styles, which are compelled to succumb to a dubious global modernity, read Western styles and sounds, to enable it to cross over to Europe